Welcome to 8 with 8, a podcast from Ohio's State Support Team 8, where we share what's on our minds and what's in the research from the field of education. Welcome to our second season of 8 with 8. We've called it Why Words Matter because we're focusing on the importance of vocabulary and background knowledge in literacy instruction. And this is an awesome kickoff episode. Today, you'll hear Janelle Schuler, Region 8's Assistant Director, and our two literacy specialists, Annette Gross and Kim Nagy, as they interview a very special guest, Natalie Wexler. She's an educational journalist and the author of the book, The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. She's also written The Writing Revolution, a guide to advancing thinking through writing in all subjects and grades. Get ready for some great new perspectives on learning gaps and what we can do about them.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janelle Schuler, and with me today are two of our literacy leaders in Region 8, Annette Gross and Kim Nagy. And we couldn't be more excited to hear from our special guest, Natalie Wexler. First of all, welcome to 8 with 8, Natalie. We are so thrilled to have you join us today. When we were thinking about this season, we were identifying researchers and authors that we really wanted to hear from. And you were at the top of our list. So to have you joining us today on our podcast is just incredible. So thank you again.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. Honored.
So let's just dive in and start with our 8 questions. Natalie, could you tell our listeners a little bit about your background and what led you to this research topic?
Sure. Well, I have a background in a number of things, but one of them is journalism. And about 10 years ago, there's a lot of education reform activity going on, or there was, in Washington, D.C., where I live. And I got very interested in it because it seemed really important, especially this gap in outcomes between basically lower income and higher income students. And I realized there wasn't enough being written about what was going on locally. And so I started writing for a local news website about education here in DC. And then I just stumbled on something that nobody was, as far as I knew, really talking about or writing about, which was much bigger than what was going on in DC and bigger than the short pieces that I was churning out. And so the idea of writing something longer and more national in scope occurred to me, and I know we'll get into what that was, but it was sort of I knew something about education as both a student, as we all have been, and my mother was a teacher, and I've done some teaching, but I've taught highly motivated adults, not quite the same ballgame as K through 12, but I have some idea of how difficult it is and how important it is. So I didn't know that much about education really, but I just plunged into it and read everything I could get my hands on and visited schools and all sorts of things.
Natalie, thank you for sharing your background with us. So interesting about your journey into the field of education. So as you know, building background knowledge is the buzz in the education community. And with that, what did you find to be the most compelling or surprising in your research?
Well, really this was, the most surprising and I guess compelling thing that I learned was that I had not understood what I was looking at when I was standing in these elementary school classrooms. And I had assumed that teachers were actually trying to build kids' knowledge of the world, their substantive knowledge. And so the real surprise for me was to discover that, in fact, they were really focusing on these reading comprehension skills primarily, sort of really divorced from content. The content was sort of a vehicle to teach the skills, is how it was being approached. And I still remember when this was first explained to me. It was actually by Judith Hochman, who I ended up co-authoring a book with about writing. But so I had gotten to know her a little bit, and I was very impressed with this method of writing instruction that she had developed. And at the time I was on the board of a charter school, a charter elementary school in DC. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if this school could use this wonderful writing method? So I asked her if she could talk to them, and she came back to me, she said, well, the problem is that this method really only works when it's embedded in content. And your school isn't really teaching any content. And I said, I don't understand. It's a school. Like, what are they teaching? And she kind of sighed and started to explain. And then, I ended up sort of going down this rabbit hole. And I think that this is very, for those outside the world of education, that's probably a very common reaction. I think a lot of parents, they would be surprised to hear that actually kids, they're not even trying to teach social studies for the most part, So I think that's the first step, is to just make people aware, as I was made aware, of what is really going on in classrooms and how it doesn't line up with, and I know we'll talk about this, what cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience, what scientists have found about how the learning process and reading comprehension actually works.
Okay, Natalie, that tie to content and background knowledge is so vital. And you have provided so many examples in your book about the role of prior knowledge and how it impacts reading. Could you share some of your findings with our listeners? Sure,
and I want to issue the caveat that they're not really my findings, because I'm not a scientist. I report on scientists' findings. And of course, the best known example of this, the role of background knowledge, is what has become known as the baseball study. And probably a lot of people out there have heard about it, but just briefly, this study, it's not that it was the only study by a long shot coming up with these findings. There are many other studies that have come up with virtually identical findings. But this was in the late 1980s, and a couple of young researchers wanted to figure out what is more important to reading comprehension. Is it general reading ability skill, or is it knowledge of the topic you're reading about? And so they chose the topic of baseball because they figured there are a lot of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. And they divided these 7th and 8th graders up into 4 groups, depending on how well they had scored on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them a passage to read describing a baseball game and tested their comprehension. And what they found was that if the kids who knew a lot about baseball all did quite well on this test, regardless of how well they'd scored on the standardized test, and the kids who didn't know much about baseball all did pretty poorly, regardless of how they scored as generally good readers. In fact, the supposedly poor readers who knew a lot about baseball scored a lot higher than the supposedly good readers who didn't know a lot about baseball on this test when baseball was the topic. And I think, that, so that is a fairly convincing piece of evidence, especially along with all of these other studies using soccer, the Vietnam War, repairing Xerox machines, whatever, that if you know a lot about the topic, you have a tremendous advantage, and that it is not the only factor in reading comprehension, but is certainly a key factor. I think the other point that needs to be made, I think, people, I think, okay, that makes sense for like a specialized body of knowledge, like baseball, or sometimes I show people a paragraph describing a cricket match. And if you don't know anything about cricket, you have no idea what that paragraph is trying to tell you. But what is less obvious, but really what's really important to understand, is how much we draw on background knowledge to make sense of all sorts of things that we read every day, or not even read. News reports we hear. We are constantly drawing on what we already know to make sense of the world around us. And so the more you know about the world around you, and the more vocabulary and I know we'll talk more about vocabulary, but the more vocabulary you have, the easier it's going to be for you to understand what you're reading or hearing, because you don't have to do all that work of like, wait, what does that mean? Should I look that up? And maybe you break off to look something up. Maybe you find the right definition, or maybe you don't, but you're losing your train of thought. You are not able to devote as much cognitive energy to the meaning of what you're reading about. And that's something, cognitive scientists have terms for this, like working memory, that you have this short-term, it's like short-term memory plus consciousness, you're manipulating information. And the thing is, it has a very limited capacity. You can only hold a few things for a limited period of time. So the more you're trying to juggle in your working memory in terms of like decoding a word, or like what does that word mean, or all of those things, the less capacity you have for things like meaning and analysis. And the more you have in long-term memory, which is potentially infinite, way, way bigger than working memory, the easier it is to use your working memory for things like figuring out meaning, because you can just withdraw a term like, double play or whatever from your long-term memory. You don't have to think about what does that mean.
Gosh, you've given us so much to think about and consider. And I love that baseball example. I think you shared that at the Ohio Literacy Academy as well. I remember that. So thanks again for sharing that. In your book, you also talk about that idea of the test score gap. And I know that was a big aha moment for me when I heard that idea of leveled text leading to leveled lives. So could you talk a little bit more about that for us?
Sure. And I just, I'm always quoting other people, and then sometimes the quotes get attributed to me. And so I want to make it clear that wonderful quote, leveled text lead to leveled lives, originated with a reading researcher named Alfred Tatum. This test score gap, which we've come to call the achievement gap, how does that relate to all of this stuff I've said about background knowledge? That has to do with two things. One is, when authors write, they are always leaving out information. They do not define every term, because if they did, it would be very tedious to read their writing. And it's not like a conversation or something where you can say, wait a minute, I didn't understand that. Could you explain it? Because it's a piece of paper or a screen. So if you don't have the background knowledge, you're really, if you're missing a certain amount of background knowledge, you're going to be stymied. And the other thing about tests is, as you probably know, but I think maybe a lot of people in the general public don't, the reading passages on standardized tests, just don't have anything. They're not designed to have anything to do with what kids are actually learning in school, assuming they're learning some things, some top content. And that's deliberate, because they're supposed to be testing just your general reading skill or ability, your comprehension skill. So the idea is, well, we're not testing knowledge. So we don't want to give some kids an unfair advantage if they happen to had westward expansion and other kids didn't. We don't want to give those kids an unfair advantage by putting a question on the test about westward expansion. But the problem is, of course, if you don't have the background knowledge to understand the passage on the test, then you don't get a chance to demonstrate your skill at finding the main idea or making inferences or whatever the test is purporting to measure. And so really, as Dan Willingham, a cognitive psychologist, has said, these reading tests are essentially knowledge tests in disguise. Now, I want to drop a footnote there and say it's not just, as I alluded to before, not just background knowledge. Another really big factor is your familiarity with the conventions of written language, that more complex syntax and vocabulary that you don't hear in spoken language. And so you may know a lot about baseball, but if you're trying to read, let's say there's a doctoral dissertation about baseball or something, you may not understand that. So that is one caveat there. And where our leveled reading system comes into this, combined with this focus on comprehension skills and strategies, is the idea is if kids just practice their skills and strategies on books or texts that are easy for them to read, that are at their supposed level, they'll get better at finding the main idea. They'll master that skill. They'll be able to apply it to any text that's down the road that's put in front of them, including a passage on a reading test. And of course, as we know, that's not going to work, because if you know about the topic, or if there's not much background knowledge assumed, which is certainly true with a lot of lower level texts, it may look like you're getting better at finding the main idea. But then you get a text maybe on an end of the year reading test that is at quote unquote grade level, and you can't find the main idea because it may assume a lot more background knowledge than you have about that topic, and it may be using more complex syntax and sort of academic vocabulary than you're used to, because you may be in fifth grade, but you've been told to read level L or whatever. And those are pretty simple books. They're not introducing you to that more sophisticated syntax and vocabulary. And you're also not acquiring much knowledge from them. And here's another thing about background knowledge. It doesn't just help you understand what you read. It also helps you absorb and retain new information and new vocabulary. It's been said, and here's another quote, I did not invent this phrase, knowledge is like Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. So if you're starting out with less of that one half of the Velcro, you're not going to be able to pick up as much new information and vocabulary as somebody starting out with more of that Velcro. And especially if you're reading simpler texts than the kid with more Velcro. So what happens, and this is how it leads to leveled lives. I'm not sure that Alfred Tatum would phrase it quite this way, but this is how I see it. We have a system essentially of tracking that begins in kindergarten with this leveled reading system. And we are relegating some kids to, this is totally well-intentioned, and we may be condemning tracking and, no, we would never countenance that. But this is essentially what we're doing. We're saying, okay, you read those simpler books with simpler ideas, and the mistaken assumption is that eventually you'll sort of move up that ladder of text complexity, but there's no way for that to happen if all you're getting is simpler texts with simpler ideas.
Okay, Natalie, you touched on vocabulary a few minutes ago several times, which is definitely a hot topic in education right now. What do you believe to be the biggest misconception about vocabulary instruction?
Well, probably that really all you need to do is teach kids, a few words, maybe a word of the day. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. That's important. And it's important to select the right words that are going to sort of be really useful in a lot of academic writing and reading. But that's not going to be enough. There's no way that you can directly teach all of the vocabulary words that kids need to know. And so there are a couple of points I like doing. One is, knowing the definition of a word, it's not just memorizing the definition. It is part of a network of meaning. It's the tip of an iceberg of meaning. So if you know the word or, and again, I borrowed this example from someone else, you probably know OAR. You have some idea of like what a rowboat is, et cetera. If you know, and at a higher level of complexity, if you really understand what the word, say, medieval means, you've got to know about history or it's not going to mean anything to you. So that's one way that vocabulary is inextricably linked to knowledge. We can't just teach those words in isolation. But secondly, and this is something I learned from reading a book called Language at the Speed of Sight by Mark Seidenberg, kids in their early years of schooling should be picking up about 8 new words a day. That's huge. We cannot teach all of those words directly. And how do they even learn all those words directly? And there have been some interesting experiments with computers, but basically what they show is that the way kids pick up that much vocabulary, and beginning, earlier than their school years, is through something that's called statistical learning, which really is just an unconscious mode of learning. And it has to do with the fact that different words are often found in proximity to one another. Like lion is often in proximity to tiger or whatever. And that has to do with building knowledge. Okay, we're going to read a book about great cats. We're going to spend 2 weeks learning about great cats. And by the end of that, you might not only know lion and tiger, but you might know the word lynx, even if it hasn't been directly taught, because you're unconsciously making those connections. And so the bottom line here is, yes, teach some well-chosen vocabulary words, but don't rely on that to build kids' vocabulary, because the only thing that will work is to build knowledge pretty coherently and systematically.
Wow, Natalie, there's so much to consider when thinking about that knowledge gap and what teachers do on a daily basis to really build that background knowledge and that reading comprehension for our students. And I'm hoping that you can share, like from in your book, The Knowledge Gap, share stories of innovative teachers and changes in their practices and how that positively impacted their students. what did you find in your research that worked best for students?
Well, there's definitely there are wonderful teachers out there who are doing a valiant job of trying to do innovative things and help build kids' knowledge. And so one of the things I did for the book was to follow, it ended up being 3 different classrooms for a school year. Originally it was supposed to be 2, but one of the teachers decided she didn't really want me in the classroom midway through the school year. But fortunately I was able to find another first grade classroom using the same basal reader, and so there was some continuity there. And the second of those teachers, so the idea was originally one classroom that's doing the standard skills-focused approach to comprehension, reading comprehension, another that's using one of these newer content-focused knowledge-building elementary literacy curricula. And the first of the skills-focused teachers, she was pretty much, going by the book, and she really did feel that this approach, and she was a great dedicated teacher, but she really felt like this, working on these skills and strategies was what these kids needed. And I'm sure there are a lot of other really dedicated teachers who feel that way. The other teacher, she felt like something was missing. And she really tried to, supplement the basal reader with stuff that would build kids' knowledge. And to some extent, she was successful. But this was a huge burden for her to try to figure out how to do this and to gather, she did a unit on Black history and women's history. Well, she tried to do a unit on women's history, but she asked these first graders, what do you want to learn about women's history? Which is another thing, let's give kids choice. And they all wanted to talk about their mothers, which is very sweet. And they all wrote little things about their mothers, but they didn't learn anything about women's history. So I think putting, what individual teachers really need to be effective and innovative is support from a school, because they only have control over the kids in front of them for 1 year. And, knowledge building is this gradual cumulative process. They don't have control over what happened the year before or what's going to happen the next year. And that's what kids really need. And that's what teachers really need to be effective. So it really has to go beyond the individual teacher. It really has to be a curriculum that extends across grade levels, and that a school or a school district supports with professional development and all sorts of things, and good materials. Because, some of these curricula will cover things that teachers themselves may not be that familiar with, like the War of 1812 in 2nd grade, which the 2nd grader class I was following, they were learning about that. And most American adults, if you ask them about the War of 1812, you will probably get a pretty blank look. So imagine being told you're going to be teaching about the War of 1812 and you really don't know anything about the War of 1812. So that's, again, where a good curriculum comes in. The teachers I've talked to who've used that curriculum said, boy, did I learn a lot about history from teaching, 2nd grade. And the first time around, maybe it's not ideal. It's better if you actually know something in advance about what you're teaching. But by the 2nd year or the 3rd year, those teachers felt, I can make this my own. I understand this material. I know what it's important for kids to get out of it. And so, for example, one teacher who I really had wanted to follow for the book, but she ended up being sort of kicked upstairs and she was no longer in the classroom by the time I got around to writing. But she had a sort of protege, and I followed the protege's classroom. And she was great. She did all sorts of innovative things. But the thing that really sticks in my mind is this other teacher. Her name was Adrienne Williams, and she was teaching these first graders about Mesopotamia one day. And this was her 3rd time around teaching this lesson. And she had noticed that, so it was a read aloud. It was a story about a boy and his father sort of walking around Babylon and sort of noticing things. And she had found that it didn't really grab the students, but she knew what vocabulary and what concepts they really needed to get out of this lesson. And so she made it more interactive. And when I walked into the classroom that morning, she told me what she was going to be doing. I was expecting to see her sitting reading this story to the kids, but instead she had taped blue construction paper on the floor of the classroom to represent the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers leading to Babylon. And she had, on the opposite end of the classroom, she had on the wall a huge poster of that Babylon with all the, the hanging gardens. And she said to the kids, okay, we're going to go on a trip today. We're going to go on a trip back in time. We're going to go back to Babylon. And she had them pretending to paddle down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And then the kids were just mesmerized. And they were also learning an enormous amount in a way that was totally engaging for them. So there are all sorts of things you can do. I think some teachers might look at these curricula and think, oh, it's scripted. Well, and I know teachers, and if I had a bad script, I would not want to be scripted. But there are good scripts and bad scripts. And even with a good script, which is a tremendous help, like you're teaching about the War of 1812 or Mesopotamia and you don't know anything about it, it's really helpful to have the script. But then you can, once you understand it, you can depart from the script and you can make it your own. So it's not just this either or situation.
Oh gosh, listening to you talk a lot about the innovative practices and that importance of engagement, it makes me, long for the times I was back teaching in the classroom. So thank you for sharing that with us. In your most recent article in Forbes, you talk about equitable practices. Could you talk a little bit more about what you found regarding equity and literacy in schools? And then you alluded to the importance of having that support at the school or the district level. Could you talk a little bit about your findings regarding what district leaders should be thinking about regarding equity and literacy also?
Yeah, I sort of got away. I started out with talking about how I was interested in this gap, right, between the kids at the higher and lower end of the spectrum. And what does all of what I've said have to do with that gap? Well, if kids aren't acquiring much knowledge and vocabulary in school, and what happens is the kids who are able to acquire all of that stuff outside of school, at home, probably because they have more educated parents, are going to have a head start and they're going to stay ahead. And so we, have the system where we're essentially replicating or maybe even exacerbating the inequities that kids bring with them to school. And once, but the teachers that I have talked to and the classrooms that I've observed that are using this different kind of approach where you're building kids' knowledge, what really comes through and what teachers have told me is it is all kids are engaged and thriving, but it is those kids who would be, in the lower reading group, the kids with IEPs, the kids who are still learning English, they're the ones who really get a chance to blossom with this focus on content and building knowledge. And often they are the kids who have the most insightful contributions to classroom discussion, because it's not that there's anything like wrong with their brains, especially, like there's some kids who really just have the difficulties decoding. And so they're relegated to these really simple books, and that doesn't represent what they're capable of dealing with. And for the kids who are lacking background knowledge, you give them some information, some grist for their intellectual mill, and you would be amazed at what they can do with it. It may look like they're just not as capable, but maybe, that's the only problem there is nobody's given them information and asked them to think about it, in a deep way. And once you do that, you can be amazed at what they can do. And I've heard that over and over again. I think this is what makes me feel so exercised and feel that there's so much urgency about this is that, not only are we depriving both those kids and the rest of us of all of that potential, but we are also doing, I don't know how much damage sort of emotionally and psychologically to these kids, because we're telling them just practice these skills and strategies on these texts that are easy for you to read and you will become a better reader. You'll get smarter. And if that doesn't happen, which, it doesn't, and then we hold them accountable later on for stuff we haven't taught them, they have no one to blame, they may feel, but themselves. And they may just decide, I'm in the dumb group, or I'm not good at school, and get very turned off and frustrated. And then we wonder why, So I think, the equity piece is huge here.
Gosh, you've given us so much to think about. It makes me think about not necessarily an achievement gap so much as an opportunity gap.
Yeah, and that is the phrase that some have proposed instead of achievement gap. And I don't know what a good phrase, some people don't even like the word gap. And so I don't know what a good phrase would be, but, I sort of settled on test score gap, because let's just call it what it is. And as we know, the tests are really blunt instruments for measuring what's going on, and they certainly shouldn't be used to guide instruction, because that way lies disaster.
We know that for sure. Thank you, Natalie. So as you look ahead in the field of education, what's next for you?
Well, I've been kept very busy by just sort of talking about the knowledge gap, and which is great. I really did not expect that I would be, over a year after it had come out, I would still be sort of talking about it. And there are many more layers to be explored. So I'm not tired of talking about it. But one thing that I am thinking I might like to explore more deeply, and have been, is the whole question of teacher training and how it relates to the difficulties that teachers face and that we all face, in society, because, and I think it's a systemic problem. I'm not casting blame on any individuals, but the fact is that teachers, there's a lot of stuff they don't learn in their training that could really help them. And there are also things they do learn that really conflict with what science has found about how people learn. And I think that has a lot to do with just the way schools of education developed on a different track from the rest of academia. There's just a lack of communication. And so it's a very complicated problem, but it seems to me that it's something we need to figure out. I don't know that it's going to be easily solved, but we should at least understand what the problem is and what the role of our teacher training institutions is in this system that's not working very well.
Natalie, could you expound a little bit about the connection between writing, comprehension, and background knowledge for our listeners?
Yeah, I think writing has been really overlooked. Its enormous potential has been overlooked and not exploited. And its potential is that, first of all, I mentioned that writing has its own conventions. Written language has its own vocabulary conventions, and things like, complex sentence construction, the passive voice, words like moreover. If you teach kids explicitly how to use that syntax, that vocabulary in their own writing, then it really helps equip them to understand it when they encounter it in their reading. That's really the most effective way to do that. And secondly, writing is potentially an incredibly powerful lever for building and deepening knowledge and making it stick. We all know you need some knowledge of the topic you're writing about in order to start writing. But in the process of writing, you're making all these connections. You're trying to retrieve information that you've slightly forgotten, and you're putting it in your own words. And cognitive psychologists, although they unfortunately haven't studied writing itself that much, they've found that when you do those things in other contexts, sometimes those are huge boosts to comprehension, to retention of information, and your ability to analyze information. And just think about it. If you have to write the topic sentence for a paragraph, that is finding the main idea in a very powerful way, and it's inextricably connected to the content you're writing about. So those are the potential benefits of writing. But the problem has been the way we've been teaching writing, to the extent we've been teaching it at all, has not allowed kids, students, to take advantage of those benefits. And the main thing there is, well, two things. One is, we've often, especially at the elementary level, just asked kids to write about their own experiences, like your trip to the amusement park. And so if writing is going to build knowledge, well, we should be attaching it to the knowledge we want to build. And that means also not like a separate writing curriculum with separate topics. So, here's 3 paragraphs about insects. Now write an opinion essay about your favorite insect. But you don't really have enough knowledge of insects at that point to write much about them. But also, do we really, maybe we want kids to learn about insects, but it's like, that's putting the cart before the horse to just try. But what can we use for a topic for an opinion essay? If kids are learning about the Civil War, they should be writing about the Civil War. But the other basic problem or mistake, I would say, that we make in writing instruction is that we expect kids to write at length from the get-go. And the problem there is that writing is way more difficult than we are understanding, than we're acknowledging. If you're an inexperienced writer, your working memory is juggling all sorts of things, everything from letter formation if you're really young, to spelling, organization of your thoughts, what word choice, and of course the content. And if you're juggling that many things in working memory, you don't have the cognitive capacity to really focus on the content and analyze it, and you're probably not going to learn to write very well. So we need to make writing easier when kids, and that could be at any grade level, if you are not an experienced writer, if you're not able to write well. You need to make it to modulate that cognitive load. And the best way to do that is to begin at the sentence level. Because if you ask people to write at length, that is yet more stuff to be juggling in working memory. And we have to explicitly teach kids how to construct sentences with conjunctions, with subordinating conjunctions and clauses, and because it's not something that they will know. Many kids will naturally just pick up through their reading, which is kind of what we've been expecting. Writing is much harder than reading. So you could be a good reader, but not a good writer. So we have to explicitly teach those things, begin at the sentence level. Also, if you can't write a good sentence, you're probably never going to write a good paragraph or a good essay. So that's another. And within the context of those sentences, we teach grammar and punctuation and all of those things that if you've got 3 pages of error-filled writing, it's very hard to teach. And you do need to teach those things, but you need to teach them in the context of students' own writing. So beginning at the sentence level and embedding the writing instruction and the content of the curriculum are the 2 basic things that we need to do to unlock the potential of writing. And I will say that there may be other methods of writing instruction out there that combine those 2 things, but the only one I know of is the writing revolution method, which, as I mentioned, Judith Hochman devised that method over a long period of years as an educator, and she and I co-authored a book about it.
I wish we had more time today to hear more about the writing revolution and your work there. You've given us a lot to think about regarding background knowledge, comprehension, and then also just also considering writing. So Natalie, thank you again for spending time with us today and talking about your research. You've given us so many important considerations around the knowledge gap. And for those of you that are listening today, you've heard so many great ideas, and right now your mind might be racing. As you reflect on your district's current literacy practices, you might want to think about what is positively impacting your students right now and what needs attention. As a literacy leader, it's up to you to make a difference for your students.
And that's it for 8 with 8. Didn't we tell you this was going to be a great kickoff episode for our literacy season? Natalie Wexler gave us so much to consider as literacy leaders in Region 8. If you'd like to learn more about Natalie and her work, head over to our website, sst8.org/podcast.aspx. There we've provided links to Natalie's work and her website. Thanks for listening, and we hope you join us next time as we hear more from our regional literacy experts as they share some practical strategies you can implement in the classroom right away. See you soon.